Hey, I'm Austin, and today I'm covering 6 deadly zoo attacks that will stay with you long after you finish watching. From a veteran lion keeper who rescued a visitor only to walk into a faulty gate corridor alone minutes later, to an elephant ride in Thailand that turned fatal because of a handmade skirt. But first, we start in Oregon, where a woman crossed a fence just to get near a polar bear. It was February 26, 2015, at the Wildlife Park in Oregon, where freezing rain coated the concrete walkways and cold wind pushed mist through the nearly empty zoo, while maintenance crews quietly moved animals between indoor holding areas before the afternoon crowds arrived. The whole place already felt wrong before anything even happened. Maren Sollis was 52 years old and had driven several hours alone to visit the zoo during the anniversary week of a polar bear transfer she had followed online for years. Friends later described her as deeply attached to rescued wildlife, especially polar bears, and said she often traveled to parks and conservation centers to see specific animals in person. The bear she came to visit was a female polar bear named Sigrid, rescued as a cub years earlier near a remote northern Canadian shipping route after her mother disappeared. Maren became emotionally invested in the story and reportedly donated to wildlife programs connected to the bear. That morning, a handful of visitors noticed Maren spending an unusually long time near the polar bear habitat. The enclosure was built around a deep concrete basin with elevated fencing, steel barriers, and multiple restricted maintenance zones designed to keep visitors away from the habitat edge below. Adult polar bears can weigh over 900 pounds and are considered among the most dangerous land predators in the world, despite their calm appearance in captivity. Shortly before noon, security footage partially captured Maren leaving the public viewing platform and entering an employee-only perimeter corridor beside the enclosure. Investigators later confirmed she climbed over 2 restricted maintenance barriers before reaching a narrow service platform overlooking the habitat below. Because of the storm, the area was almost completely deserted at the time. Investigators later determined Maren had likely been drinking before arriving at the zoo. Responders found an open liquor bottle and prescription medication inside her vehicle after the attack, though officials never publicly disclosed the full toxicology findings. Witnesses earlier that morning described her behavior as emotional and erratic, with one visitor reporting that Maren appeared to be quietly speaking toward the enclosure while staring down at Sigrid near the pool below. Investigators believed Maren attempted to move farther along the restricted platform to get closer to the enclosure edge for photographs or a better view of the bear, but freezing rain had coated the metal grating and concrete surfaces with ice. Security footage later showed Maren slipping while climbing around the outer maintenance railing bordering the platform. She fell roughly 10 feet into the enclosure below. The few visitors still nearby immediately began shouting for help as Maren struck the sloped concrete near the pool hard enough to visibly injure her leg and shoulder. Several people later reported hearing her cry out while attempting to drag herself backward toward the retaining wall. Sigrid reacted almost instantly. The polar bear charged across the enclosure from less than 30 feet away and reached Maren within seconds before she could stand, knocking her against the concrete near the waterline before dragging her several feet across the enclosure floor. Maren reportedly tried shielding her head while screaming for help as the bear bit repeatedly into her arm and upper torso. Zoo staff activated emergency alarms immediately, while visitors were evacuated from nearby viewing areas. Keepers attempted to distract Sigrid using compressed air deterrents and emergency noise devices, while veterinarians prepared tranquilizers, though specialists later confirmed sedation would not have worked quickly enough to stop an active attack already underway. The attack continued for nearly 2 minutes as responders struggled to reposition the bear long enough to safely isolate sections of the enclosure using hydraulic separation gates. By the time keepers redirected Sigrid into a secondary holding section, Maren had suffered catastrophic injuries, including massive blood loss, blunt force trauma, cervical fractures, and extensive tissue damage across her torso and arms. Paramedics entered the enclosure within minutes, but Maren was pronounced dead at the scene before transport could begin. The investigation later concluded the enclosure had functioned properly, and that Maren's death resulted from unauthorized entry into multiple restricted areas during hazardous weather conditions. Wildlife specialists also confirmed Sigrid displayed normal predatory behavior throughout the attack and would not be euthanized following the incident. Footage from the incident was withheld by authorities for further investigations. Maren walked toward danger because she couldn't let go, but this next story hit me differently. He walked toward it because he simply never knew how to stop giving. It was September 18, 2018, at a private wildlife park outside Durban, South Africa, where humid evening heat clung to crowded pathways, while security teams rushed across the carnivore section, responding to a perimeter disturbance near the restricted service corridors shortly before closing time. Jabari Ndlovu was 39 years old and had spent more more than 12 years working inside the reserve's carnivore division. Other keepers trusted him because he stayed calm during dangerous situations and rarely lost control under pressure. Outside work, he volunteered during coastal flood disasters and helped deliver emergency supplies to nearby townships after storms. And people like that usually become the person everyone depends on, not the other way around. Privately, though, Jabari's life had started falling apart. His marriage had collapsed over the previous year, and co-workers noticed he barely went home anymore. Most nights, he slept inside employee housing near the predator section, saying it made early rounds easier. But weeks before the incident, he picked up extra shifts, skipped meals, and volunteered for difficult animal transfers other keepers avoided. Staff later admitted he looked exhausted almost constantly, but nobody considered him reckless. If anything, they trusted him too much because he always seemed like the guy who could handle one more thing. That afternoon, reserve security reported a man climbing beyond the public barriers behind the lion complex. Jabari immediately responded alongside 2 security officers. The restricted service area sat behind concrete retaining walls and narrow keeper corridors connecting indoor dens to outdoor habitats. African lions can weigh over 400 pounds and move shockingly fast over short distances. The visitor was a 30-year-old former delivery driver named Themba Kosa, who had wandered into a restricted service walkway behind the lion habitat, while apparently trying to get a closer look around the reserve before closing time. Witnesses later described him as panicked and disoriented after realizing he had crossed into an employee-only area surrounded by drainage concrete and locked fencing. Security teams spent nearly 20 minutes guiding him back to safety before finally pulling him over the barrier with a harness. And during that time, most people probably thought the dangerous part was already over. But immediately afterward, reserve radio traffic became chaotic as security locked down nearby pathways and staff began containment checks around the lion section. During the confusion, Themba reportedly slipped away from the medical area and wandered through an improperly secured maintenance gate connected to the rear service corridor. Earlier that week, maintenance crews had reported problems with a hydraulic transfer gate near the lion section. The locking pin sometimes failed to fully seat unless manually checked, but repairs had been delayed. Security footage later showed Themba entering the narrow corridor alone, apparently believing the area was empty. But investigators later determined Zara, a 9-year-old lioness, had not yet been fully transferred into the secondary holding den, while staff completed remote containment checks after the earlier disturbance. Moments after Themba entered the corridor, the partially latched transfer gate shifted open just enough for Zara to force through. The lioness slammed him against the concrete wall hard enough to dent a steel storage cabinet beside the control panel. Zara bit into Themba's shoulder and upper chest, driving him to the floor inside the cramped corridor with nowhere to escape. Witnesses later described hearing repeated impacts against concrete as the lioness dragged and pinned him during violent bursts of movement. Jabari and armed response staff rushed toward the corridor after surveillance operators reported the attack over reserve radio. Staff activated compressed air deterrents while veterinarians prepared tranquilizers, though later reports confirmed sedation would not have acted fast enough during an active mauling. The attack continued for nearly 2 minutes before hydraulic pressure and noise finally forced Zara backward long enough for responders to secure the corridor and enter safely. Paramedics reached the corridor within 8 minutes and attempted stabilization before transporting Themba to a nearby hospital, where he died less than an hour later. Investigators later concluded the attack began after the visitor entered a restricted maintenance corridor during an active containment response. Jabari and other staff members were not blamed in this incident. Themba died trusting his own judgment one moment too long, and Lena's story shook me because she died trusting someone else's. It was June 11, 2017, at a marine park in San Diego, where seawater mist drifted across the empty stadium before sunrise, while trainers prepared the main performance pool for a private promotional event scheduled hours before the park opened to the public. Lena Park was 34 years old and had spent years trying to build a career around travel videos, tourism campaigns, and resort partnerships. Sponsors liked her because she always looked polished, stayed professional, and somehow made every place feel luxurious on camera. But behind all of that, friends said she's burnt out and stressed about views dropping, worried about losing sponsors, and always chasing the next post that might finally keep her career going. The Marine Park campaign ended up being one of the largest contracts Lena had booked in months. According to people close to her, she needed it badly. In the weeks leading up to the shoot, she barely slept between editing sessions, airport layovers, and sponsored uploads. Staff later said she arrived carrying backup cameras, multiple outfits, portable lighting gear, and enough filming ideas to stretch the trip into several sponsored posts across different platforms. The stadium pool sat beneath gray coastal skies with seawater mist drifting over the concrete platforms before sunrise. Orcas are among the most intelligent marine predators on Earth, capable of recognizing routines, objects, and repeated behaviors from trainers and handlers. Adult males can weigh over 9,000 pounds and generate enormous force even during normal movement. Staff at the facility had repeatedly documented one male orca named Coda displaying fixation behavior around loose objects in the water, especially floating fabric, hoses, and dangling equipment during enrichment sessions. But most of these incidents ended harmlessly, so it was never divulged to the public and did not make the local news. Before filming began, production crews held a safety briefing, reminding everyone to secure loose clothing and keep a safe distance from the waterline. Lena initially tied back her hair and changed into fitted wardrobe pieces approved by the park. But during camera tests, one marketing coordinator reportedly suggested loosening her hair because it looked more natural on video. Nobody corrected it afterward. The shoot itself was supposed to stay entirely platform-based. Direct in-water interaction between performers and orcas had already been heavily restricted at the facility for years, following multiple safety reforms across the industry. Lena's role was simple. She would kneel near the edge of the platform, while Coda surfaced nearby during controlled photo passes, directed by trainers from a protected position farther back. Filming began shortly after sunrise. As cameras rolled, strands of Lena's loose hair and part of her lightweight overshirt drifted close to the waterline, while Coda surfaced beside the platform. Security footage later showed the orca briefly mouthing the floating fabric near her side. One trainer immediately issued a release command while another signaled Lena to stay still, but Lena instinctively pulled backward the moment she felt tension against her clothing. Investigators later believed that sudden movement may have intensified Coda's fixation response. The orca submerged while still gripping part of the fabric, yanking Lena off the platform hard enough for her head to strike the concrete edge before she fell into the water. Emergency alarms activated instantly as trainers began recall procedures from the platform. Underwater cameras later showed Coda circling tightly around Lena beneath the surface, while responders attempted to redirect him using trained signals and acoustic cues. Later, marine behavior reviews avoided describing the incident as a deliberate attack. Instead, specialists concluded the whale likely remained fixated on the moving fabric and chaotic movement inside the water. Witnesses saw Lena resurface briefly multiple times before being forced back under by Coda's movement through the pool. Staff deployed floating barriers and distraction equipment, while emergency responders rushed toward the medical access platforms nearby. Lena managed to grab part of the deck before another sudden movement pulled her away again. The struggle lasted over a minute before responders finally separated Coda long enough to retrieve her from the water. Lifeguards pulled Lena onto the medical platform unconscious with severe bruising across her torso, scalp lacerations, and compression injuries around her neck and shoulder. Paramedics arrived within minutes and continued CPR during transport to a nearby trauma center, but Lena was pronounced dead shortly afterward. The coroner later listed drowning, cervical trauma, and prolonged forced submersion as the primary causes of death. The marine park suspended all promotional animal shoots within days. Internal investigations later revealed repeated safety shortcuts involving private influencer events and inconsistent enforcement of appearance restrictions near active animal platforms. Coda was not euthanized because behavioral specialists concluded the incident aligned with previously documented object fixation behavior patterns rather than predatory aggression. Footage from the incident was soon deleted due to its high graphic content. Lena understood the risks, but got slowly worn down by them. And then there's Tommy, who walked into that enclosure without the ability to recognize any risk at all. It was April 3, 2015, at the Riverside City Zoo in Louisiana, where heavy humidity hung over the crowded reptile house, while stagnant water reflected dim overhead lights across concrete enclosures packed with weekend visitors escaping the afternoon heat. Children pressed against fogged viewing glass as the smell of algae, whetstone, and standing water drifted through the building. Tommy Aguilar was 27 years old and had traveled to the city with two friends for a short weekend trip after recently bouncing between construction jobs across Texas and Louisiana. Friends called him Tox because he joked constantly and could make strangers laugh within minutes. But the truth is, Tommy's life had been falling apart for years. I found reports about drug arrests, disappearing for days at a time, and relationships with family members completely breaking down. At some point, people around him seemed to stop asking if he was okay because they already knew things probably weren't getting better. Earlier that afternoon, Tommy and several other visitors spent hours drinking near the riverfront before entering the zoo, shortly before closing time. Witnesses later said Tommy became increasingly detached as the day went on, laughing to himself, staring into exhibits too long, and repeatedly insisting some of the animals looked fake. Toxicology later found methamphetamine, alcohol, and dissociative drugs in his system. The reptile section sat beneath heavy humidity and the smell of stagnant water drifting through shaded concrete walkways. Saltwater crocodiles can remain motionless for hours while monitoring movement around them, which is honestly part of what makes them dangerous. People start mistaking stillness for safety. Security footage later showed Tommy standing at the viewing rail for nearly a minute, staring at Oscar, a 14-foot crocodile lying partly beside the basin. Several nearby visitors heard Tommy laughing quietly while tossing small gravel pieces toward the animal's tail. Oscar never reacted. Somehow, that became enough for Tommy to convince himself the crocodile wasn't real. The enclosure used a decorative outer railing, a landscape divider, and a second containment fence around the actual habitat. Months earlier, staff had already discussed modifying parts of the barrier because some sections were easy to climb. But the changes were delayed after administrators argued nobody had ever tried entering the enclosure before. Now this really frustrates me. Tommy climbed over the first barrier. Visitors immediately started yelling for him to stop, while others ran for zoo staff. Even two adults trying to grab Tommy as he crossed the landscaping area, but he pulled away and climbed the secondary fence before anyone could stop him. According to some witness accounts, several people were yelling at Tommy to come back while one zoo employee activated an emergency radio call from the walkway. But Tommy just ignored everyone and dropped nearly 8 feet into the enclosure perimeter. Video footage later showed him crouching beside Oscar and placing one hand against the crocodile's armored back, preparing to sit on it. When the Oscar did not move, he swung one leg partly across the crocodile's body, and that was when Oscar exploded sideways. Witnesses later described hearing a loud cracking sound when the crocodile's jaws clamped across Tommy's chest and shoulder. Tommy screamed and clawed at the concrete, while Oscar dragged him toward the basin. Several visitors started throwing bottles, shoes, and nearby objects into the enclosure, while others screamed for staff to help. One man even tried climbing over the outer barrier before security officers pulled him back. Oscar submerged almost immediately while maintaining his grip. Cell phone footage later captured violent turbulence as the crocodile rolled underwater. Zoo staff rushed in within seconds, carrying catch poles and compressed air deterrents, while handlers worked to isolate the animal using submerged partition gates. Paramedics arrived within 6 minutes, but responders could not safely enter the basin until Oscar was secured behind the hydraulic barrier system. Tommy was pronounced dead at the scene after recovery teams pulled him from the water. The coroner later documented drowning, catastrophic crush injuries, cervical fractures, and severe blood loss caused by repeated rotational trauma underwater. Investigators later concluded the enclosure itself technically functioned properly, but earlier recommendations involving climb deterrents and visitor barriers had never been fully implemented. The cell phone footage was then removed and kept by authorities. Tommy never had a chance to understand what he was facing, and somehow that makes Daniel's story even harder because he understood it perfectly for 16 years, right until the moment it didn't matter anymore. It was November 14, 2017, at a privately operated wildlife park outside Johor Bahru, Malaysia, where humid afternoon air hung over crowded concrete walkways, while children's music, tour announcements, and overlapping birthday celebrations echoed through the Predator Amphitheater during a packed holiday weekend. Daniel Varga was 41 years old and had spent nearly 2 months traveling across Southeast Asia, filming wildlife parks and tourist attractions for a small travel blog he ran back in Hungary. He wasn't a huge creator or anything, but he took the blog seriously enough to spend most of his savings chasing unusual experiences he hoped would finally grow his audience. Friends later said he had a habit of getting a little too comfortable around animals. Daniel specifically visited the park for the tiger performance after seeing videos online showing handlers standing just feet away from full-grown Bengal tigers. But what really stands out in this case is knowing that Daniel spent most of the afternoon near the front row, filming constantly and asking staff how close visitors could get after the show. He was clearly very focused on getting closer to the tigers, and I found it surprising that nobody stepped in or treated that behavior as a warning sign before things escalated. One of the park's biggest attractions was a male Bengal tiger named Malik. He weighed over 580 pounds and had spent most of his life around crowds, loudspeakers, flashing cameras, and live shows. But according to the handler's notes, Malik had always reacted badly to sudden loud metallic noises or chaotic crowd energy. Things like speaker feedback or crashing equipment had triggered pacing and aggressive lunges before. Veterinarians had reportedly warned the park several times to reduce overstimulating environments around Malik's performances, but management never made major changes because nobody had been seriously hurt before. The covered amphitheater trapped heat and amplified noise from the crowd. Even trained tigers still react on instinct when startled, which honestly makes live predator shows feel way more fragile than they look from the audience seats. That afternoon, the arena was packed because several school groups and tour buses had arrived at the same time. Near the end of the show, production crews behind the seating section started moving a portable lighting rig used earlier for promotional filming. According to investigators, one of the wheel locks on the portable lighting rig slipped after rolling over wet concrete near a spilled drink stand. Witnesses said the entire structure suddenly tipped sideways into a metal crowd barrier before crashing straight into stacked speakers beside the seating area. The noise was apparently brutal. Metal slammed into concrete, speakers screeched with feedback, and the sound echoed across the covered arena hard enough to make people physically jump in their seats. Malik reacts immediately, and right as the crowd started panicking, Daniel reportedly moved closer toward the front railing, still trying to film the tiger through the confusion. Investigators later believed that sudden movement near the edge of the arena probably made Malik even more reactive in that moment. The tiger flattened his ears, dropped low to the ground, and lunged toward the front perimeter before handlers could fully redirect him. Witnesses described Daniel stumbling backward after partially losing balance near the low front barrier, as Malik slammed against the service gap separating the performance zone from the audience edge. The tiger managed to hook Daniel with one forelimb and pull him partially into the restricted perimeter area before handlers triggered emergency lockdown procedures. Malik immediately clamped onto Daniel's shoulder and upper torso before dragging him several feet across the concrete floor. Families ran toward exits while handlers screamed evacuation commands. Cell phone footage later captured pieces of the chaos: children crying, adults stumbling over seats, and Daniel desperately trying to shield his neck while Malik repeatedly repositioned his grip. When emergency alarms were activated, nearby handlers triggered remote slide gates and deployed compressed air deterrents from behind a secondary barrier. Malik briefly released Daniel once before lunging again as more screaming erupted from the crowd. Witnesses later described hearing low growls, people screaming, and Daniel gasping between the impacts against the concrete. And for me, that's probably the hardest part of this case, because it means he was still conscious through part of the attack. The mauling continued for over a minute before hydraulic barriers and repeated deterrent blasts finally forced Malik backward toward the holding corridor. Responders rushed in the moment the secondary gates sealed behind the tiger. Paramedics reached Daniel within minutes, but he died during surgery less than 2 hours later. Investigators later concluded the attack was triggered by a sudden loud noise inside an already overstimulating arena environment, combined with crowd panic near the performance area. The wildlife park permanently suspended all live predator performances within 2 days. Camera footage was kept away from public eye in respect to Daniel's family. Daniel knew exactly how dangerous his world was, and Carmen had no idea. And reading both stories back to back, I kept thinking about how little that difference actually changed the ending. It was August 22, 2016, outside Chiang Mai, Thailand, where humid afternoon heat settled over narrow forest trails, winding through a crowded wildlife tourism park. Wooden ride platforms creaked beneath moving tour groups, while handlers guided visitors through muddy downhill paths lined with bamboo, hanging vines, and dense tropical trees after heavy overnight rain. Carmen Villanueva was 41 years old and had just retired after nearly 20 years working as a restaurant chief in Arizona. Based on what I gathered, this Southeast Asia trip was supposed to be the reward she and her new husband kept delaying because life kept getting in the way. Bills, work schedules, aging parents, the usual stuff that most of us can relate to. So the dream vacation was pushed and eventually set aside. And when Carmen finally booked the ticket to Thailand, she was so excited about preparing for the elephant excursion. Her friends later said that she even spent weeks embroidering her own outfit, including the travel skirt decorated with stitched shells and small metal ornaments. Carmen wanted every photo from the trip to feel personal and memorable. Personally, reading that part stuck with me a little because it sounds exactly like something a thoughtful person would do without ever imagining it could become dangerous. Her husband later told investigators Carmen had been especially excited about the elephant ride. She loved animals, but like most tourists, her understanding of elephants mostly came from zoos, documentaries, and travel advertisements showing smiling families riding calmly through forests. The park itself looked organized and safe, without any major incidents reported. The elephant trail wound through humid jungle paths with uneven downhill sections beneath low-hanging branches. Asian elephants can weigh over 8,000 pounds, but even trained elephants can gradually become distressed when pain or irritation builds over time. The elephant assigned to Carmen was a 34-year-old female named Baya. Handlers generally described her as reliable during tourist rides, though some staff later admitted she occasionally became irritable during longer downhill sections in hot weather. Before loading passengers, the senior Mahout briefly noticed the small metal shell ornaments attached to Carmen's handmade skirt while helping her onto the wooden riding platform mounted on Baya's back. He He adjusted part of the fabric away from the saddle edge before the ride started, believing it would not cause problems during the relatively short route. At first, the ride appeared completely normal. Carmen's husband walked alongside parts of the designated pedestrian trail, taking photographs while the elephants moved slowly through the forest. Carmen was even smiling happily in photos, while Baya navigated shallow slopes and muddy sections, but later investigators realized the situation had probably been building for several minutes before everything finally went wrong. As the ride continued down the uneven jungle trail, the wooden platform kept shifting slightly from side to side. Other riders later said Baya started looking more uncomfortable as they moved downhill. She kept flicking her ears, shaking her head, and stopping more often than usual. At first, the handlers thought she was just irritated by the heat because she was still listening to commands and staying on the trail. What nobody noticed at the time was that part of Carmen's handmade skirt had slowly slipped beneath the riding blanket during the ride. One of the small metal shell ornaments kept rubbing against the area beneath the saddle every time Baya stepped downhill. Witnesses later described Baya becoming visibly agitated before the attack fully began. The elephant started breathing harder, swinging her trunk repeatedly, and resisting directional commands from the mahout. At one point, the handler briefly stopped the group and attempted to reposition part of the riding blanket after noticing Baya shifting uncomfortably beneath the platform. But as the ride resumed down another uneven slope, the saddle platform shifted sharply sideways again. Baya suddenly released a loud distress cry and lurched violently off the trail path. Carmen lost her balance and was thrown from the platform hard enough for her head to strike an exposed tree root beside the trail. But the panic did not stop there. Still distressed and disoriented, Baya continued swinging the partially shifted platform against nearby trees while handlers shouted commands and attempted to calm her. One broken wooden support beam struck Carmen across the chest as she tried crawling away from the trail edge. Nearby elephants reportedly became agitated by the noise and shouting, making the situation even harder for handlers to control. The mahout eventually managed to position himself between Baya and Carmen while continuing verbal commands and pressure hook guidance. But during another abrupt movement, Baya stepped onto Carmen's lower torso before handlers finally regained enough control to move the elephant backward. Emergency crews reached the trail within 8 minutes and found Carmen barely conscious with catastrophic injuries. She was airlifted to a trauma center but died during surgery later that evening. Investigators later discovered Baya had suffered a severe harness injury years earlier after a poorly fitted riding saddle tore skin and tissue along her right flank near the ribs. Although the wound healed, veterinary records reportedly noted the scar area remained highly sensitive to prolonged rubbing and pressure beneath riding blankets and saddle straps. Officials ultimately concluded the incident matched a progressive pain-induced distress response caused by repeated irritation against the old injury during the trail ride rather than a sudden unprovoked attack.